friends, Romans, countrymen. I'm going to tell you about Roman history. So the advertised talk for today was focusing on the Roman Republic. I kind of changed it at the last minute. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to spend about an hour covering about 1,000 years of Roman history, from the beginning of the Roman Republic to the fall of the Western Roman Empire. We should be able to handle that pretty easily in an hour, right? There won't be a test, so you don't have to take notes. But where do we begin? How do you tell the story of the rise and fall of Rome? Where is the origins of that? Well, a good place to start is with this. SPQR. What does that mean? What does that stand for? The letters themselves are an abbreviation of a Latin phrase, Senatus Populescum Romanum, the Senate and the people of Rome. That is a very important concept in the story of the Roman Republic and even in the story of the Roman Empire, the Senate and the people of Rome. The idea of Rome, the idea of being a Roman, evolves over time, evolves as the Roman state itself grows, as the empire is established. But the key notion in all of that is the relationship between Rome and the Senate and the people. So we'll keep that idea, SPQR, in mind. If you go to Rome, you see these letters stamped on everything. Mailboxes, garbage cans, sewer lids. It's still today the symbol of the city of Rome. So we're going to begin our story by looking at the birth of the Roman Republic. The city of Rome itself, or what becomes the city of Rome, was established sometime around 800 BCE. So almost 3,000 years ago. You had what were originally agricultural villages scattered on these 7 hills, eventually fusing together. And when Rome first emerges as a habitation center, it wasn't an independent state, it wasn't an independent city, it was dominated by the Etruscans. The Etruscans were a highly advanced, civilized people to the north of Rome. And the Etruscans were an urban dwelling people. They lived in cities, walled cities, and they had kings. Well, this new settlement of Rome soon comes under the sway of the Etruscans. And eventually, there are Etruscan kings of Rome. So the Romans were ruled by these outsiders, by these Etruscans. Now, the influence of Etruria is very important in the story of Rome. Rome develops as a city because the Etruscans were urbanites. The typical dress of the Romans, when you think of a Roman, what do you see them wearing? A toga. You also think of John Belushi, perhaps. But you think of a toga. A toga is adopted by the Romans from the Etruscans. So many of the stereotypical aspects of Roman life, what we think of about Rome, are adopted from the Etruscans. Well, the Romans and the Etruscans have this kind of love-hate relationship. The Etruscan kings are ruling over Rome, but the Romans don't necessarily want the Etruscan kings there, particularly by the time we get to the 6th century. Rome is growing, it's becoming economically prosperous. The wealthy in Rome, the patrician class, are becoming richer and more powerful. The plebeian class, the commoners, are not necessarily getting richer, but have a growing sense of pride in Rome. Well, what happens? How does Rome come out from under the thumb of the Etruscans? Well, the traditional story has to do with an act of sexual violence. The last Etruscan king of Rome was a guy named Tarquin the Proud. And the story about Tarquin was that he, was proud. He thought of himself very grandly. In 509 BCE or thereabouts, his son attacks and rapes the daughter of a prominent, wealthy Roman patrician family. An event that is known as the rape of Lucretia. Her name was Lucretia. It's a scene that artists have depicted for centuries, as you see right over here. The Renaissance artists, the Baroque artists always go back to this idea of the rape of Lucretia. Now, you have this aspect of violence at the origins of the Roman Republic. Well, what happens after this event? Lucretia, traumatized by what had happened, tells her father, tells her husband that she was attacked by the son of Tarquin the Proud. And the patrician Romans band together and essentially revolt and kick the Etruscan kings out. Now, Lucretia herself ends up committing suicide, as the story goes, because she could not live with the shame of what had happened to her. Now, Lucretia becomes, in many ways, an important figure in the mythology of Rome and in the mythology of Roman women, because she is the example to which other Roman women aspire, that symbol of faithfulness and being true to herself, being true to her family. That was kind of the example that was expected of Roman women. She felt guilt by the attack on her, ended her own life, and becomes a symbol of this propriety that the Roman women were going to aspire to. In any case, in 509, Tarquin is kicked out. The Romans get rid of their last king. And with the eviction of the king, the Romans now have a problem. Well, we don't have a king anymore. What are we going to do now? How are we going to govern ourselves? Well, the solution was relatively ad hoc. They kind of made up a system of government. What the Romans create comes to be called the Roman Republic. And the Roman Republic essentially was dominated by the Senate. The Senate becomes the main government organ of the Roman Republic. Now, who were the senators? Who were those people that occupied seats in the Senate? They were the patricians. They were the very wealthy, the upper classes, the large landowners. They become the ruling body in the Roman Republic. But what about all those plebeians? What about all those other people, the commoners who didn't have the money, who weren't in that senatorial class? What about them? Well, they'll eventually make their voice heard. But early on, Rome in the Republican era is concerned with staying alive. They are concerned with maintaining their independence. They've gotten rid of the Etruscan king. They are organizing themselves into a senatorial republic, but they are beset on all sides by enemies. The Etruscans to the north threaten Rome. To the west, to the east, there are other Italian tribes that are threatening Rome. Rome essentially has to fight for its survival, has to fight for its existence right from the very beginning. Well, how do the Romans fight? Who makes up the military branch of Rome? The Romans developed this concept of the citizen soldier. The idea was that any free Roman who was a land-owning Roman, you were considered free, would put down their plow and pick up their sword in defense of the Republic. And it is these citizen soldiers who become the backbone of early Roman success. The citizen soldiers who own land, but when the city's in danger, leave their land and go fight to defend the land, that begin the process of Roman expansion. So from these relatively humble origins, fighting for their survival, the Romans and these citizen soldiers begin to conquer. They begin to conquer their neighbors. They begin to extend their influence. They wage war against the various other groups on the Italian peninsula, and slowly, one by one, begin to conquer all of the Italian boot. As you see over here on the map, Rome and the area of Latium, the area immediately around Rome, is there in the bright red. And soon the Romans begin conquering northward, conquering southward, so that by the middle of the 3rd century BCE, the Romans control all of the Italian peninsula. Now, that leads to further complications, because as the Romans are conquering, as they are subjecting their neighbors and other people, what do we do with those groups? How do we treat them? Do we allow them to become Roman, or do we keep them as separate groups? And as Rome is conquering, as the soldiers are acquiring more land, what does that do for the idea of the citizen soldier? And what about all those plebeians back in Rome who want a political say? They're being kind of shut out of victory and glory because they don't have the money, they don't have the political power. That's still all in the hands of the Senate. So Rome is expanding across the Italian peninsula, but as it grows, it runs into all of these social and political issues. Eventually, the Romans do begin to solve many of those issues. For example, what to do with those conquered people in Italy? Well, they start off by granting them citizenship to the groups closest to Rome. To the Romans themselves, citizenship was seen kind of as the reward. If you played nicely with Rome, we'll help you become part of Rome and you will have a stake in what Rome is doing. So it was seen as the carrot. The Roman military might was seen as the stick. And that's how they kind of convinced their neighbors, convinced the people that they were interested in to play along nicely. If you agree with us, we'll give you citizenship. If you don't, we'll send our army to destroy you. So Roman citizenship becomes an important aspect of the growth of the Roman Republic. So Rome, by the 3rd century, has conquered much of the Italian peninsula and starts casting its eyes to some of the islands nearby, particularly the island of Sicily, right at the tip of the Italian boot. Sicily at that time was tremendously productive agricultural land. Grapes, wheat, olives, all of these important commodities were produced on the island of Sicily. But Sicily itself was culturally diverse at this time. There was a large Greek heritage. After all, many of the early cities had been established by the Greeks. In fact, the city of Syracuse, right over here, really maintained its status as a Greek city-state, perhaps the most important Greek city-state in the Mediterranean at this point. Other parts of the island of Sicily had been occupied by other foreigners. Rome's great regional rival, in fact, had established colonies and outposts on the coast of Sicily. That regional rival was the city of Carthage. Carthage was a city that had been established by the Phoenicians on the coast of North Africa, modern-day Libya area. And the Carthaginians were a seafaring people. Their might, their wealth was based on their navy, was based on control of the seas. They traded throughout the Western Mediterranean, and as they traded, they established colonies on the Iberian Peninsula, modern-day Spain, on Sardinia and Corsica, and on Sicily. Well, the Romans, a land-based power, are trying to expand onto Sicily. The Carthaginians, a sea-based power, have outposts in Sicily. What inevitably happens? The two sides run into each other and begin to confront each other over control of the resources on the island of Sicily. That competition for land and resources in the middle of the Mediterranean, here's Carthage, and this is the Carthaginian Empire displayed on the map. Carthage itself was a tremendously vast and imposing city. So you have the two sides competing for control over the island of Sicily. And inevitably, that leads to warfare. In 264 BCE, the Romans and the Carthaginians go to war. The Romans call this conflict the Punic War. Punic is derived from a Latin term for Carthage. And to us, as historians, it becomes known as the First Punic War. Now, that name gives you a hint of what happens, right? If it's the First Punic War, what can we assume? There's at least one more. There are, in fact, in total 3 Punic Wars. So the First Punic War is fought between the Romans and the Carthaginians for control of the island of Sicily. Now, Rome was a land-based power. They wanted to fight on land. Carthage was a sea-based power. They wanted to fight at sea. What's going to happen? How is this war going to be resolved? Well, the Romans, though a land-based power, were also very practical. and very innovative. And they decided, you know what? The only way we can defeat Carthage is if we build a navy and fight against the Carthaginians where they are fighting. So Rome begins to build a massive navy. But the Romans weren't really naval strategists, at least not yet at this point. So they devised a tool to allow them to defeat the Carthaginians. Now, naval warfare during this period was dramatic. Generally, the navies had triremes, which were large ships that had three ranks of oars. They could be powered by oar, they could be powered by sail. When you were engaged in combat, you had all the people rowing, and you wanted to get them to row as fast as possible. Now, how many of you remember the movie Ben-Hur? When he's a slave on the galley and you have the guy with the drum and he goes ramming speed and he's really going fast and everybody's pulling the oars. Ramming speed was the speed you used for combat. The idea of naval combat during this time was that you would take your ship, which had a giant bronze prow, the front end of it, and row as fast as you could into the side of your enemy ship, smashing your enemy ship to bits. Now, the Romans said, okay, that's a method, but we're going to do something else. What the Romans devised were essentially boarding planks, giant walkways with spikes at the end. And when they got close to a Carthaginian ship, they'd drop these walkways into the Carthaginian ship, the spikes smashing through the Carthaginian deck, and then the Roman soldiers would go from their ship onto the Carthaginian ship and kill all the Carthaginian sailors. So they actually brought land warfare to sea. In any case, this war is long, it is drawn out. It doesn't end until 241, but it does end as a Roman victory. Now here in this image, you see Roman soldiers crossing to a Carthaginian ship. And here's a typical trireme with the bronze prow over here to smash into your enemy ships. The Romans do win. The Carthaginians are defeated in 241, and Rome gains control of the island of Sicily. It is now added to the Roman Empire. Carthage isn't destroyed. Carthage is basically chastised and bitter, but they are still there, and they are still a major power here in the Western Mediterranean. But Rome now controls Sicily. Well, what happens? What happens is that the Carthaginians are unhappy with their defeat. The Romans are kind of arrogant. Rome begins to encroach on other Carthaginian territory, particularly in Spain, on the Iberian Peninsula. The Carthaginians have lots of colonies on the Iberian Peninsula, and the Romans begin to insert themselves into events on that side of the Mediterranean. They start to form alliances with some of these Spanish cities and start encouraging their allies to ignore the Carthaginians or to attack the Carthaginians. And of course, the Carthaginians are brutally unhappy about this, particularly because they're still steaming from that earlier defeat. They are still bitter about that defeat in the First Punic War. So, as the Romans become more intrusive and more invasive of Carthaginian territory, and they encourage their allies to do the same thing, the Carthaginians finally say, we've had enough. We don't like the Romans, and we are going to teach the Romans a lesson. Now, the Carthaginians, during this period, at the end of the 3rd century BCE, had a tremendously gifted military leader, a guy named Hannibal. How many of you have heard of Hannibal? What's he famous for? The elephants, of course. Everybody says the elephants. Hannibal grew up hating the Romans and saw an opportunity to get revenge against Rome. So what he does is he organizes a tremendous army on the Iberian Peninsula in Spain, destroys some of the Roman allies in Spain, gathers up this massive army and decides, I am going to bring war to Rome itself. He decides on invading Italy. Now, to invade Italy, he had to march his army up, around, and through the Alps. Now, Hannibal, from a North African state, had in his army war elephants. Elephants are big animals. And he goes over the Alps with this vast army, including the elephants. You see dramatically illustrated there. That elephant is not having a good day. He's falling off the mountain. In any case, Hannibal and this massive army make their way through the passes of the Alps, war elephants included. Now the Romans know Hannibal is coming. They have people watching out. So they say, okay, we'll go out, we'll meet Hannibal when he comes out of the Alps. And they assemble an army in the plains of northern Italy. Hannibal comes out of the Alps, and the Romans see the army across from them, and they are terrified. Why? The elephants. Imagine if you had never seen an elephant before, and suddenly you're sitting there awaiting battle, and there are these giant animals with armor and a bunch of Carthaginian warriors. Hannibal brings the elephants into Italy. The Romans are terrified, and Hannibal defeats the Romans. That becomes a theme for what Hannibal does in Italy. He begins to march southward toward Rome, defeating every Roman army that is sent to stop him. No matter what the Romans do, they cannot stop Hannibal's army. The elephants are largely gone at this point. Not a lot of them survive the Alps. But Hannibal's generalship, his leadership, his skill is such that every Roman army is defeated. In southern Italy, one of the greatest defeats in Roman history occurs when a Roman force goes out to fight against Hannibal at the Battle of Cannae. What Hannibal does at the Battle of Cannae is undertakes an envelopment maneuver. He occupies the Roman army with his front, sends his flanks around, surrounds the Roman army, and destroys it. Hannibal seems invincible. But there is a problem. Hannibal is defeating all of these Roman armies, but can't defeat Rome itself. The reason is Rome is a fortified city. The Romans have strong walls and heavy gates protecting their city. And Hannibal doesn't have any siege equipment. So he can go and camp outside of Rome, but he can't get into the city itself, and the Romans are very secure within their walls. The other Roman settlements throughout Italy are fortified settlements. So the only thing that Hannibal can do is march around in Italy, destroying what he can, trying to lure Roman armies into combat. Eventually, the Romans say, you know what, we're not going to send any armies out until we are ready. And Hannibal is marching around destroying things in Italy. He begins to try to pry some of the Roman allies away from Rome on the Italian peninsula. He shows up and says, hey, the Romans aren't helping you. They're not going to defend you. They can't even defend themselves. Why don't you join me? And at first, that strategy doesn't really work. But eventually, after years of marching around in Italy, some of those Italian allies do begin to join Hannibal against Rome. That ends up not being a good idea for those allies. In any case, it looks like Hannibal is invincible. The Romans can't do anything. In Rome, there is a crisis. The senators are saying, how are we going to save Italy? How are we going to save Rome? And eventually they decide to allow one Roman general, a guy named Scipio, to form an army and take that army to Africa to attack Carthage itself. So Hannibal is tied up in Italy, and the Romans send an army to North Africa and attack Carthage. Well, when word reaches Hannibal that Carthage is under attack, he has to leave Italy to go defend his city. He abandons his campaign in Italy, goes to North Africa, and fights against Scipio at the Battle of Zama. Hannibal is defeated in North Africa and eventually goes into exile and dies somewhere in modern-day Turkey, I believe. The defeat at Zama, or the victory at Zama, is a profound victory for the Romans because they have defeated their single greatest enemy thus far. They have stopped Hannibal. They have saved Rome. Scipio, for his part, is given a title. He is given a title by the Roman Senate. He is now known as Scipio Africanus because he wins his battle in Africa. He goes back to Rome to great public acclaim. The Carthaginians, for their part, are punished by the Romans. They are forced to sign a treaty. They are forced to give up many of their colonies on Sardinia and in Spain. All of that now becomes Roman territory. The treaty that the Carthaginians are forced to sign says that essentially Carthage is now a vassal state to Rome. and that the Carthaginians are not allowed to wage war without first getting permission from Rome. The Carthaginians also have to pay this tremendous indemnity to Rome to make up for all the damage. So Rome defeats Carthage again, increasing its power in the Western Mediterranean. The Romans then turn their attention to those allies on the Italian peninsula that weren't so loyal and mete out severe punishment there. And once again, reestablish control on the Western Mediterranean. All of this area in blue now joins the area in red, becomes part of the Roman world. In the meantime, in Rome, there is great debate. There is the question of, why didn't we just get rid of Carthage? Why didn't we just eliminate them? They're our biggest rival. And even though we've twice defeated them and essentially relegated them to a secondary position, why didn't we just get rid of them entirely? One of the leading advocates of the destruction of Carthage was the senator, Marcus Porcius Cato, the elder. Every speech he gave in the Senate, every time he spoke publicly in Rome, he ended his speech saying, "Ceterum censeo, Carthaginem esse delendum." It is a certain thing that Carthage must be destroyed. He advocated the absolute destruction of the city of Carthage. Well, Carthage isn't destroyed, at least not immediately. This treaty that is signed between the Carthaginians and the Romans holds on for about half a century. But then what happens? Carthage gets into a regional disagreement with another North African kingdom. And the Carthaginians decide to wage war on that North African kingdom. But they didn't get permission from Rome. The Carthaginians send an army into the desert of North Africa to fight against their rival. The Romans say, "Aha, you violated the treaty." And the Romans launch the Third Punic War. The Third Punic War begins in 149, a very brief war in terms of the Punic Wars, and it ends with the complete destruction of Carthage. The Romans send a massive army into North Africa and essentially massacre all the Carthaginians, destroy the city, pull down all the buildings, burn everything to the ground, and then famously plow the entire city under. And as they are plowing it, they sprinkle the soil with salt, symbolically making it barren and sterile so that nothing else could grow there. And once the Romans have done that, they build their own city of Carthage on the same location. The Romans, as I mentioned, were very practical, and Carthage was situated in a tremendously important natural harbor in North Africa. The Romans destroy the Phoenician Carthaginian city and build a Roman Carthaginian city. So if you go to Carthage today, the ruins you see are the ruins of the Roman city, not the Phoenician city. In any case, by 146 BCE, Carthage is gone. Rome is dominant in the West. Now, the Eastern Mediterranean was still independent of Rome. You had a lot of different kingdoms and a lot of different states over on that side. But many of the kings and many of the states, very well aware that Rome is expanding, start to make alliances with Rome and start to try to protect their position by becoming friendly with Rome. Some of the kingdoms, the kingdom of Pergamum, actually the king there says, you know what? When I die, Rome can inherit my kingdom. So after the Punic Wars, when Rome has control of the West, they slowly start moving into the Eastern Mediterranean. So Roman power is continuously expanding. As we see, by about the time of the end of the First Punic War, Roman power extends from Spain, the Italian peninsula, and the islands here in the middle, along the Adriatic coast to Greece, the Balkans. So they are beginning to expand, they are beginning to extend their influence throughout the entire Mediterranean. Now, these victories, these military victories by the Romans are tremendously good for the growth of the Roman state, but they lead to significant internal social problems within the Roman Empire itself. How did the Roman Republic pay its soldiers? Not salt. Well, salt was one of kind of the salary things. The reason oftentimes that Roman soldiers fought was because when they were victorious, they were given grants of land in the conquered territory. So victorious armies got land. So you have Roman soldiers spreading out all of this newly acquired land in the Roman Republic being distributed to the various generals to distribute to their soldiers. But while the Republic itself is growing, internally in Italy, there is a problem. The problem is that many of those wealthy patricians are starting to buy up all of the farmland in Italy to create these large industrial farms that are called latifundia. All of those small farmers that had once owned land are being dispossessed from their land. They're essentially homeless now. And they start migrating into Rome itself. We see a population boom in Rome. The fact that you now have a large number of landless peasants in the Roman Empire, though, is a crisis for the military. Because what were the qualifications to be a Roman soldier? You had to be a Roman citizen. And citizenship entailed the ownership of land. Now that you have more and more people who are being dispossessed from their land, who are losing their land, they are essentially losing their status as citizen. They are losing that Romanus part. They are becoming disenfranchised in the mechanisms of the Roman Empire. The rise of the latifundia leads to increased social turmoil in Rome. The rich are getting richer, the poor are losing any status that they had. Well, that is a situation that is frankly untenable. The military might of Rome depended on those citizen soldiers. As the military pool grows smaller, it threatens the military expansion of Rome. And it leads to political instability within Rome itself. And what we begin to see by the 2nd century BCE is social turmoil within Rome and within the Roman Republic. Growing numbers of landless poor are being dominated by the wealthy patricians and the senatorial class. And you have a social imbalance. It leads to problems, it leads to turmoil, it leads to protest. Eventually, there are a couple of voices that begin to speak up in defense of the landless poor. Two of the most important are the Gracchi brothers. The Gracchi came from a noble, wealthy Roman family, but they advocated land reform. They advocated giving land to the landless poor, essentially breaking up the latifundia in many ways, so that the stability of the Roman Republic could be guaranteed, could be preserved. Well, the older brother, Tiberius Gracchus, begins to get involved in politics, to push this reform agenda, to kind of push this notion that Rome needs a landed, working farming class. We can't survive on just the power of the military and those large latifundia. He is trying to overturn the social upheaval in Rome. He is trying to reform the system. Well, what happens oftentimes to reformers? How do they end up? They end up dead. And in fact, that is what happens to Tiberius Gracchus. He is assassinated by his political enemies. He's elected as a consul, as a representative of the people, but he is assassinated before he can institute his reforms. The mantle of reform is then picked up by his younger brother, Gaius Gracchus, who again gets involved in politics, pushes this idea of social reform to preserve the Roman Republic. He too is elected into important offices within the Republic. And what end does he meet? He too is assassinated like his brother. So what we see with the Gracchi is the intensifying of that social discord in Rome, the separation between rich and poor, the haves and have-nots, the powerful and the not powerful. And the reformers who step into this chaos to try to change the system are are assassinated by their political enemies. So the Roman Republic, though expanding and starting to dominate the Mediterranean, is beginning to rot at its core. It is suffering from tremendous internal stresses. The period of the Gracchi brothers underlies this, or highlights this internal struggle and the growing dysfunction within the Roman Republic. That growing dysfunction becomes very apparent in the 1st century BCE, when Rome is torn by civil war. Political factions in Rome begin to line up behind successful military commanders. The civil war in the 80s is headed by 2 opposing generals, both Roman generals, both successful military commanders of the wars of the Roman Republic in North Africa and Asia Minor, even within Italy itself. You have Sulla and you have Marius, but they had support from different political factions within Rome. One had support from the senatorial class, one had support from the plebeian class, from the people. They had competitions of commands as they were fighting wars against each other, each one trying to outdo the other. And what we see happening is that the prestige of the generals and the loyalty of the troops to their commanders starts to become the defining power factor within Roman politics. It's no longer the Senate that's in control, it's now the generals that are in control. And in fact, at one point, Sulla takes control of the city, but has a military command and leaves the city with his troops, leaving a power vacuum that Marius goes into, and Marius begins to hunt down all of the supporters of Sulla and massacre them. When Sulla hears that, he turns his army around and goes back to Rome, chases Marius from the city, and then hunts down all of Marius's opponents. You have bloodbath, you have political discord. In the end, the back and forth between Marius and Sulla does end with a form of political stability. One of them does maintain control. The Roman Republic does not fall apart. But what we see is a great weakness in the Roman Republic. After the civil wars, it becomes very apparent that any charismatic general with the support of his army can be a power player in Rome and could perhaps emerge as the dictator, as the ruler of Rome. So the social discord brought about by Rome's great victory in the Punic Wars leads to political discord, here culminating with the civil war in the 80s, in the 1st century BCE. By the time the civil wars come to an end, Rome is continuing to expand. They now have this uninterrupted stretch of the northern Mediterranean, stretching from Spain, the Italian peninsula, all the way over here to the west coast of Asia Minor, where the old Greek colonies were. And they are increasing their hold here in North Africa, expanding out from the area of Carthage. So you have this political turmoil, but continued growth of the Roman Republic. During this period of continued growth, and in the aftermath of the civil wars, there are new political leaders that begin to emerge in Rome, a new generation of politicians that come after the Punic Wars, that are shaped by the civil wars. 2 of the important figures in this new leadership in Rome are Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great, and Marcus Licinius Crassus. He's just known as Crassus. Pompey was a successful military commander, prestigious, great victories on the frontiers, loyal troops. And as we know, that's a key to success in Rome now. Crassus was not as successful as a military commander, but he was perhaps the richest man in Roman history. He had a tremendous bank account and was able to buy loyalty in many ways. There's a legend about Crassus that one of the ways he made money in Rome was by running private fire departments. There were no city-run fire departments. They were all privately run. And whenever there was a fire, his fire department would go and put out the fire and be paid by the Senate. The story is that he ran many of these, or owned many of these fire departments, but he also had on his payroll a lot of arsonists who would go and start fires that his fire department would go put out, and he'd make money that way. He owned a lot of land. He was very influential and very powerful. So you have these new leaders emerging in Rome in the wake of the Civil War. Charismatic figures, wealthy figures that are trying to establish themselves in the ruling elite of Roman society. Now, while these men are making a name for themselves, there is internal turmoil in Italy once again. In 73 BCE, there is a slave revolt in Italy. It's the third one, hence the name the Third Servile War. This one is perhaps the most famous, though, because it was led by a Thracian gladiator by the name of Spartacus. You may have seen the movie with Kirk Douglas a long time ago in the 60s. Spartacus was, by what we know from the history, a Thracian. Thrace is an area north of Greece who had fought with the Romans, then been captured by the Romans, sold into slavery, trained as a gladiator. A charismatic, skilled leader who leads a revolt in the southern Italian town of Capua, rallying his fellow gladiators to essentially murder the gladiator masters. And from that beginning, this slave revolt encompasses all of southern Italy. Most likely what Spartacus wanted was to go back home and to be left alone. But his revolt proves to be an existential threat to the Roman Empire. The Romans begin sending armies out to deal with these gladiators, to deal with these slaves, and those armies are defeated. They are massacred. They are crushed. And soon the Spartan revolt becomes a major political issue in Rome. How are we going to defeat these slaves? What are we going to do? Well, eventually, combined armies led by Pompey and by Crassus are sent into southern Italy and overwhelm Spartacus and his followers, and the Third Servile War comes to an end in 71 BCE. Pompey and Crassus have tremendous prestige. They have saved Rome. So they are expecting all sorts of glory and all sorts of rewards from the Senate. But the Senate is becoming stingy on offering these rewards, letting generals have triumphs through the city. So the Senate is trying to maintain its authority. The powerful, charismatic generals are resentful of the Senate. In the meantime, there are new rising stars in Rome. One is the orator and politician, Marcus Tullius Cicero. The other is a military commander by the name of Gaius Julius Caesar. Caesar does play a role in the putting down of the Spartacus revolt, but he's kind of a minor figure in that. Cicero, however, becomes the voice of the Senate in many ways, trying to protect the senatorial prerogative against the charisma of the generals. Cicero will become a bitter opponent of Julius Caesar eventually, denouncing Caesar as a tyrant later on. So you see these rising stars, these military leaders, these politicians that are starting to become the face of the Roman Republic during this period in the middle of the 1st century BCE. And their personalities and their interpersonal conflicts are all starting to shape the destiny of the Roman Republic. Well, Caesar, his reputation starts to grow. He himself becomes a successful military commander, begins to have many, many troops that are loyal to him. He emerges as kind of the third most powerful person in the Roman Empire, up there with Pompey and with Crassus. The three of them soon begin to coordinate their activities. You have the three of them versus the senatorial class. The three military commanders against Cicero in many ways. The generals want their glory, they want their triumphs, they want their celebration, and the Senate refuses to give it to them. So what happens? Well, the three men, Pompey, Crassus, and Caesar, decide to combine their power. They decide to work together to essentially take control of Rome. And in 60 BCE, the three of them form this partnership that comes to be called the First Triumvirate. Again, if it's the first one, what do we know is going to happen later on? There will be another. The First Triumvirate was essentially an informal alliance of these three powerful figures in Rome. The military leader Pompey with his loyal army, the military leader Caesar with his loyal army, and Crassus, unsuccessful, not the most successful militarily, but certainly with the biggest bankroll. The three of them, when they combined their power, when they combined their influence, essentially were able to control Rome. They take turns holding many of the important offices within the Roman establishment. They essentially corral the power of the Senate. Cicero, the voice of the Senate, rails against the power of the triumvirate, but is unable to actually do anything about it. Now, one of the ways that these guys maintained their power and their influence was by waging war. So oftentimes two of them would be in Rome and one would be off fighting a campaign on the frontier. The one who was fighting the campaign, if they were victorious, gained prestige, gained influence, gained the loyalty of their troops. So there was a sense of jealousy among them too. When Pompey was on campaign, Caesar was jealous. When Caesar was on campaign, Pompey was jealous. They each wanted to outdo the other, but maintain control of Rome. In 58 BCE, Caesar undertakes an operation to conquer Gaul. Gaul is essentially modern-day France, which was not part of the Roman Empire at this time, part of the Roman state at this time. The Gauls themselves were fiercely independent, and Roman armies that had tried to subdue the Gauls were often defeated, often unsuccessful. So in 58, Caesar says, I will conquer Gaul. And he takes his loyal armies, marches them into France, and wages a protracted war against the Gauls. He famously records this event in one of his many writings on the Gallic Wars. And in the book that Caesar writes, Caesar can do no wrong, of course. He famously says, Galliat omnis divisa in partes tres. All of Gaul is divided into three parts. The Romans had to conquer those three parts. And then, after 8 years of warfare against the Gauls, finally, Gallia est pacata. Gaul has been pacified. When the last Gaulish leader, Vercingetorix, don't ask me to spell his name, appears before Caesar and surrenders. Caesar has conquered Gaul. He has conquered all of that vast territory. His soldiers have acquired riches and land in Gaul. Rome has acquired riches and territory in Gaul. Caesar is at the peak of his power by 50 BCE. He is glorious and triumphant with a powerful, loyal army. In Rome, however, Caesar is beginning to be seen as a threat. The memory of Sulla and Marius is still fresh in the minds of the Senate, and they see one general becoming immensely powerful, and that powerful general could be a threat to the Roman Republic. So the senators begin to throw their support to Pompey. They say, Pompey's our guy. He is going to be the counterbalance to the power of Caesar. And Pompey is given some military commands, and he goes off and tries to find glory. In the meantime, the Senate increasingly sees Caesar as a threat. And eventually, they order him to come back to Rome. They send him a message. They say, Caesar, you have to come back to Rome, but you can't bring your army with you. And Caesar is smart enough to know that's a really bad idea. If I show up in Rome without my soldiers, I am very, very vulnerable. I will be vulnerable to the forces of the Senate. I will be vulnerable to the forces of Pompey. So what we see happening in the wake of the Gallic Wars and Caesar's great triumph is yet another civil war. Caesar versus Pompey in this one. Crassus has gone off and died in Syria in battle. So it's really these two guys. The Senate backs Pompey. Caesar is essentially on his own. But Caesar does have the love of the Roman people and his loyal troops. So what's going to happen? What is Caesar going to do? He's been ordered to come back to Rome by himself. He says, not going to do that. If I come to Rome, I'm coming with my army. So he brings his army into Italy in 49 BCE, famously crossing the Rubicon. The Rubicon is a river that runs essentially the border between France and Italy. Now, by bringing his army across the Rubicon, he is, in a way, declaring war against the Senate. He is saying, I have a powerful, loyal force, and I will stay with them and bring them with me. Supposedly, when he crosses the Rubicon, he says, Jacta alia est. The die is cast. Whatever happens now happens. I am going to Rome with my army. The Senate, of course, gets word that Caesar has crossed the Rubicon, and they are terrified. And they say, Pompey, get your army and go out and face Caesar. But Pompey doesn't really want to face Caesar. He doesn't like the odds. So instead, he takes his army and kind of marches it around and ends up in Asia Minor. Rome is left open. Caesar comes into the city and enters into the city with his army. It forces the Senate to give him a triumph. He rides through the city, celebrated, and essentially becomes the power in Rome. But what about Pompey? Pompey's still out in the east with his army. Pompey has to be dealt with. So eventually, Caesar takes his army and goes out and confronts Pompey at the Battle of Pharsalus, defeating Pompey. Caesar is now the unopposed ruler of Rome. The Senate can do nothing. And Caesar returns to Rome, the source of power, the figure in the Roman Republic. Of course, Caesar has lots of enemies. And what happens to Caesar? Those enemies conspire against him. And on the Ides of March in 44 BCE, Caesar is assassinated. William Shakespeare, famously in his play Julius Caesar, makes this the centerpiece of the play. The assassination of Julius Caesar by his political enemies, including Brutus. Now, Caesar is killed. The senators who conspired against him thought that by assassinating Caesar, they were going to save the Roman Republic. But in fact, what they do is they hasten the end of the Republic. Because Caesar has many loyal friends, many loyal associates, and many loyal heirs. Two of Caesar's heirs are his adopted son, Octavian, and his close confederate, Mark Antony. Octavian and Antony didn't necessarily like each other, but they both venerated the idea of Caesar, and they both wanted to exact revenge for the assassination of Caesar. The two of them reach a political agreement with a third person, a guy named Marcus Lepidus. And Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus form themselves together into the Second Triumvirate. They essentially divide the Roman world among them, each one controlling a different sector of the Roman world, and determined to avenge Julius Caesar. So what do? They go on a period of intense warfare, hunting down Brutus, hunting down the other conspirators, and eventually eliminating all of them. While this is going on, Lepidus, the third member of the Second Triumvirate, is kind of squeezed out. He is very quickly dropped. They had him there at the beginning, but then power devolves to Octavian and Antony. They become the two central figures in the Roman world in the wake of the assassination of Julius Caesar. Now, the two men didn't necessarily like each other, but they realized that they were the political powers and that they had to form some sort of an association. So in order to create an alliance between them, they essentially say, Antony, you control the Eastern Mediterranean. Octavian, you control the Western, and we'll cement this agreement by marriage. Antony marries Octavian's sister. Her name was Octavia. Why not? So they become brothers-in-law. That's great, except that Antony is in the east, in the Eastern Mediterranean, and while he's in the Eastern Mediterranean, he pays a visit to Egypt. And who is in Egypt? Cleopatra. Now, Cleopatra is really perhaps one of the most important rulers in Egyptian history, the last ruler of an independent Egypt. She was a tremendously astute politician. When Caesar was rising to power, what does she do? She forms an alliance with Caesar, a romantic alliance, but it benefits her, it benefits Egypt. After Caesar's assassination, she sees which way the wind is blowing and begins cozying up to Antony and forms a romantic relationship with Antony. Again, very astute. Now, the problem that begins to emerge is that Octavian and Antony are starting to become geopolitical rivals. They each want more power. That relationship, that alliance that was cemented by marriage, that begins to fall apart because what does Antony do? He goes and falls in love with Cleopatra and shacks up with her, kind of abandoning Octavia. That, among other things, causes Octavian to see Antony as a rival, as an enemy, and soon the two halves of the Roman Empire are waging war against one another. Antony and Cleopatra versus Octavian. That internal fighting, that yet another civil war, comes to an end at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE, when the Roman navy and army led by Octavian defeats the Roman navy and army with some Egyptians led by Mark Antony. Antony falls on his sword at the end of the battle. When news reaches her that Antony is dead, what does Cleopatra do? She commits suicide too. The traditional story is that she gets a poisonous snake to bite her. There are probably easier ways to do it, but that's dramatic, right? So Actium is an important battle in the story of Rome because Antony is defeated, Octavian is victorious. Octavian now becomes the ruler of all of Rome. Now we're still in the period of the Roman Republic here. Octavian is the powerful force, but he becomes very careful to respect the Senate, to at least pay lip service to the forms of the Roman Republic. He doesn't want to be seen as a dictator. What was Caesar's fatal flaw was that people saw him as a dictator. Octavian doesn't want that. He wants to be seen as the defender of Republican ideals in Rome. So he, when he comes back from victory, he presents himself to the Senate and the Senate acclaims him and the Senate gives him titles and gives him rewards. He doesn't need to do that because he has the power, but he's very careful to follow those forms, to follow those ideas. So much so that 4 years later, around 27 BCE, the Senate grants Octavian the title of Augustus, the revered one. He has acquired all of these different titles granted to him by the Senate. This one is the grandest of them all. With the title of Augustus, he is granted the imperia, the right of command. And what we see with the ascension of Augustus is the end of the Roman Republic and the birth of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire will eventually conquer the entire Mediterranean. At its height, it will reach from northern Britain in the north to Syria and Mesopotamia in the east to the southern part of Egypt in the south. The entire Mediterranean would be dominated by Rome. In fact, the Romans go on to call the sea the Mare Nostrum, our sea. We control it. Everywhere you go in the Mediterranean, you are in Roman territory, patrolled by Roman navies, guarded by Roman armies. The first 200 years of the Roman Empire would be a period of tremendous growth. The empire would reach its furthest extent in the middle of the 2nd century. You have emperors who ruled for a long time, people like Hadrian and Trajan, Augustus himself, and Marcus Aurelius. You do have a couple of wackos thrown in there just for good measure, your Neros and your Caligulas. But that first 200 years of the Roman Empire, when Rome has consolidated their hold on the Mediterranean, sometimes referred to as the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. There's no need to really fight wars within the Mediterranean because everything is controlled by Rome. It's a period of unprecedented economic and political prosperity in the Mediterranean. Many of the monuments of Rome that we see today, the Colosseum, the Pantheon, the temples scattered throughout the Mediterranean, North Africa and Turkey and Italy and other places were built during this period of the Pax Romana. But what happens? After that 200-year run, the emperors become less good. And you have emperors who are outright crazy or just plain evil, who are executing people for no reason. And by the middle of the 3rd century, you even have a year of the 6 emperors, where there are 6 men who are acclaimed as Emperor of Rome. That period of the Pax Romana, when it comes to an end, ends dramatically. And what we begin to see from about 180 through the middle of the 3rd century is a steady decline in Roman power and Roman prestige. The borders begin to contract a little bit. The might of the Roman Empire isn't as great as it once was. Roman armies are occasionally defeated in battle. You have outside entities making their way into the Roman Empire, looking for safety, the so-called barbarians. Now, what does the term barbarian actually mean? When you think of a barbarian, what are you thinking of? Think of long hair, beards, guys dressed in fur. The term barbarian is very specific, though, when you think about the Greco-Roman world. To the Greeks and to the Romans, a barbarian was somebody who was not Greek or Roman. So you could be the wealthiest man in your Germanic tribe. You could have a PhD in astrophysics. But if you didn't speak Greek or Latin, you were considered a barbarian. So the barbarians were those Germanic tribes from the north that begin crossing into the Roman Empire. Why are they doing that? They're looking for protection, because there are even more barbaric groups coming from the east. The Huns, for example, migrating west, putting pressure on all these other groups. So the German tribes are trying to find safety in the Roman Empire. You see a steady decline economically and politically within Rome. The political stability of the empire is in fragments. Emperors are assassinated by their bodyguards. You have internal strife looking for control of the Roman Empire. Eventually, the situation becomes so dire that the Emperor Diocletian divides the empire. He creates a Western Empire and an Eastern Empire, and he puts 2 leaders in each of those. It's a period called the Tetrarchy, the rule of 4. The empire is divided, and it remains divided, an Eastern and Western Empire, until the early 4th century, when the Emperor Constantine reunites the empire, briefly. Now, what is Constantine most famous for in terms of Roman history?
Christianity.
He legalizes Christianity. Christianity, for centuries, had been an outlaw religion in the Roman Empire. Why is that? It's not that the Romans were religiously prudish. In fact, they adopted all sorts of religions. As they conquered, they adopted local gods and put them in their pantheon. What was the problem that the Romans had with the Christians? Was the idea of monotheism. One God. See, the Roman emperors viewed themselves as gods. And when they died, they went into that pantheon. The Christians didn't worship at that pantheon, so they must have been a threat to Rome. In any case, it's Constantine who does eventually legalize Christianity, make it acceptable in the Roman Empire. It doesn't become the state religion in the Roman Empire for another 100 years or so, but Constantine takes that big first step. The Roman Empire does continue to decay, does continue to fall apart, divided again after Constantine. And toward the end of the 5th century, the western part of the Roman Empire politically ceases to exist. Those barbarian invasions and the internal strife eventually lead to the collapse of Roman authority in the West. But what about in the East? In the East, the Roman Empire will continue for another 1,000 years, until the middle of the 15th century. It will change its name. It becomes the Byzantine Empire. It's centered on the city of Constantinople, but you have emperors there until the 15th century, when it is finally overrun by the Ottoman Turks. And that, in a little bit more than an hour, was a summary of the rise and fall of the Roman Republic and a coda with the Roman Empire. Does anybody have any questions?